So Joseph is this enigmatic character in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, the tribes. But what's unique about him, of course, is the famous story where his brothers are jealous of him, and they ultimately, in their rage of jealousy, they want to kill him. They ultimately sell him into slavery. He ends up to Egypt. First, he's a servant, then he becomes a then he's thrown into prison. He finally comes out of prison, interprets Pharaoh, the king of Egypt's dreams, and he's appointed viceroy of Egypt. So he comes from the depths of the abyss, and there he goes to become the second in command in Egypt. He turns Egypt into a superpower because he interpreted the dreams correctly, that first there'd be 7 years of plenty, and then followed by 7 years of famine. And in his ingenious way, devised a whole plan to store grain, which was the commodity of the time. And as such, Egypt became, during that great famine, the source of sustenance for all the neighboring countries. And there you have it. This, of course, would lead subsequently to the story of the slavery and exodus from Egypt, but that's not what we're covering. We are covering here the story of Joseph himself. What is enigmatic about him is that on one hand, he seems to go to the deepest depths, literally hitting rock bottom of life, literally in prison, rotting away. Who knows what would happen to him? And he rises to become literally the commander, the leader of the world at the time. When his brothers finally come to Egypt to be able to buy some grain for their own sustenance, Joseph recognizes them, though they don't recognize him, because he was only 17 years old at the time. And he puts them through a whole ordeal. Well, ultimately, they do reconcile, and in their great embarrassment, he reveals himself to them. And instead of punishing them, or in any way, any retribution or vengeance, he actually says, "You did not put me here." These classic words. It is God that sent me to this place in order to become a source of life for you and our family and for our father, Jacob. And Jacob ends up coming to Egypt together with his family and the Jewish people, which was then 70 people, 70 souls strong, that was it, moved from Israel, from the land of Canaan, as it was called, to Egypt. And they lived their best years there until, of course, Pharaoh turns on them after Joseph's death, enslaves them, and as I said, that's the next part of the story of Exodus from Egypt. So let's focus on this Joseph. Joseph began his life, like his brothers, as shepherds. They were all shepherds. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's sons were all shepherds. Why did they choose to be shepherds? So there's a very interesting reason given to that. Because the sheep graze in the fields. These were very spiritual people, transcendent souls, you can say, free spirits, and tending to sheep was very conducive. Instead of being involved in the Wall Street of the time and in the negotiations and the marketplace, they tend to sheep, and that was very conducive for them to meditate, to pray, to philosophize, to search out God, and that's where they were shepherds. The first one that broke that pattern was Joseph, not at his own will. He would have been a shepherd like his brothers. But once he was ripped away and they sold him into slavery, first he became an accountant, actually, maybe the first Jewish accountant. And then he became, as I said, the second in command, and he managed a superpower's business, the business of grain trade. And what was interesting is after 22 years, when they finally do reunite, and he tells his brothers, tell my father that I am alive, because his father thought he was dead, and he was grieving for him, his favorite son Joseph. Joseph sends them a message and a secret code almost, telling Jacob that I still remember what we studied together when I was back with you 22 years ago. So 22 years had passed. Joseph was completely new paradigm, a new world. Became a businessman, essentially. And yet, he retained that innocence and that connection to what he studied. So here's number one lesson in life that we can learn from Joseph. And that is the ability to balance and integrate the two very seemingly antithetical components in our lives, which are what? We all need to survive, and we have this survival aspect of our lives, and then there's a need for transcendence. Some people call it the body and the soul, the animal soul, the divine soul. And there's a battle going on. Because most of the day, most of the time, a third of our lives we're asleep, if you sleep 8 hours a night. Then there's eating, there's drinking, there's shopping, there's grooming, there's socializing. Most of our lives is involved primarily in survival. When I say survival, I don't mean minimal. You can be a prosperous billionaire, but still your focus is on your needs and your existence in this world. Physical needs and all the other things that come with that. But there's also a transcendent component to our spirits. We seek something more than just getting by. Life becomes too much of a boredom. We're not happy with animal bliss. So there's another voice within us, it's called transcendence. Now that transcendence is not always easy to access because we're busy making a living. We're busy trying to survive, trying to exist. So some of us compartmentalize. Weekends, vacations, evenings, mornings, times that we focus on something more spiritual. When I say spiritual, I don't just necessarily mean spiritual. Anything that is more transcendent, music, art, travel, romance, sexuality, intimacy. And of course, religion, faith, spirituality. Something that is not quite tangible, not quite about being grounded. The analogy, a beautiful analogy for this would be the difference between the flame and the wick. A soul is compared to a flame. It's flickering, it's restless, it's seeking, it's aspiring, it's dreaming, imagining. We're looking for something more than just getting by. We're looking for something that is magical in our lives. But then there's the wick. The wick grounds us, the wick brings us down, the wick is necessary because it keeps us grounded in this world. But there's a battle between these two voices. You can say the battle is sometimes compared to the battle of filling your selfish needs, indulging in your own needs, or transcendence, serving others, helping others. So, generally speaking, philosophically speaking, thinkers, poets, romantics, what do? You either choose one or the other. Or, as I said, you compartmentalize. So some people are involved more in the materialistic part of their lives. And when you talk about more the transcendent things, either they satisfy it in minimal ways, but not necessarily fully satisfied, or they get distracted. Listen, you can also turn money and materialism into an end in itself, and somewhat numb that the soul's yearnings, your soul and spirit's yearnings for something more sublime. Others gravitate more to the spiritual, and that's why you find the ascetic lifestyle, where like a shepherd, you separate yourself and you live in a quiet place without the whole hoo-ha and the whole rush hour of life, because it's more conducive, it's easier to be able to seek out and live a more spiritual life, a more austere life in that sense. Can you integrate these two in the full sense of the word? Well, most people see this as two different worlds. They're dichotomous. The world of spirit, the world of matter. The world of energy, the world of matter, spirit and body and soul. The physical and the spiritual. And there's ultimately a duality. But here's a lesson that Joseph teaches us. There's actually a third dimension that's neither spirit nor matter. Joseph was able to enter the material world, and not just enter into it, lead it. As I said, he became the leader of the entire grain industry at the time, which was like the commodity of, think of it, technology today, or oil, or fossil fuels. That was the commodity of the time, and still maintained his spiritual integrity. Why? Because he recognized that materialism is not an end in itself, and he was able to spiritualize his material life. So it's not about escape or duality or compartmentalization. It's actually about recognizing that there is something in common, that even when you're immersed in the most material aspects, you can connect to something greater. There's a beautiful Hasidic story that captures this. This was a student, a disciple of, known as the Alter Rebbe, Rab Shneir Zalman of Liadi. Binyamin Klesker was his name. So on one hand, he was a very successful businessman, but he was also a very soulful person. And he, of course, dealt with this challenge himself. So the story goes like this. He was once making his calculations, his annual calculations, his essentially what happened, income, expenses. So he had for every month, income, expenses. The Hebrew months, so you could say the English months. So January, this was the amount of money he made, income, these were the expenses. So it was a net total of so much and so much. In February, income and expenses. March, he listed it all. And then when he came to the total, what happened in this year? The total, instead of writing a number, he wrote the words in Hebrew, Ein Oid Milvade. There's nothing but the divine. There's nothing but God. That the true reality is something that's beyond numbers, beyond money, beyond possessions, beyond acquisitions, and so on. So the question is asked, if he was so focused on a higher transcendent life, how did he have the presence of mind and the composure to be, and every month he should have written January equals the divine, February the divine. No, on each line he actually wrote the numbers, and he ran a successful business and an ethical business. But when it came to so how was that? How did he do both? And the answer is, if he would have written on every line God, then he shouldn't be in business. He should be a rabbi, a teacher, a spiritualist. No, but he was a person whose feet were firmly planted on the ground. And he understood that you need to know your calculations. You need to be on earth. You need to know the laws of the land, so to speak. At the same time, when it came to the sum total, what is the total of it all? He understood that money and all his possessions and all his successes was a means to how is he going to use it for a deeper spiritual goal. I remember when my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, was published, early years, it was going back almost, talking about 27, 28 years ago. Well, it was 27 years to be exact. So it was quite a popular book, and I was receiving a lot of feedback. There's one gentleman I met, an executive of a pretty prominent business in New York. No, without mentioning names for confidential purposes. And he was known as a very tough businessman. I mean, he was respected, but he was known tough negotiator, a difficult guy. And he told me the following story. He said, I got a copy of your book. Someone gave it to me as a gift. I began reading it, and it was beautiful, especially the chapter on business. I think wealth and I think charity and wealth is a chapter. It talks about business and money and so on. That money is exactly this message from the Prince of Egypt, Joseph. And one of the suggestions there was that in your business, not just at home, not just in your synagogue, in your spiritual environment, but even at your workplace, have a charity box on your desk. And from time to time, put something in there. You have a meeting, encourage other people to as well. Let's begin the meeting with a little charity. And that's what he did. And he said it changed the entire climate of the meetings because people started seeing, what's this charity box? And he said, I read in a book, Toward a Meaningful Life, let's begin the meeting with putting in a nickel, a dime, a quarter, a dollar, whatever. People started seeing, he says, that my clients, my partners, potential mergers, potential business colleagues began seeing another side to me. They said, oh, did you give charity? He says, of course. And in his workplace, he was elevating the workplace. He says, we became friends in a different way. We continued doing business. I was still a tough negotiator. I didn't give in. But we started seeing each other as human, not just purely as a numbers game and a pure negotiation, a pure business shark arrangement. Then he said to me, I began then purchasing your book in boxes, just as an aside, had it in a box in the corner of my office, and I would give it to people. He said, it changed my entire work, it made it actually more successful because our relationships became more trustworthy. We started seeing each other as people. Just this little act. This is an example. So there are things we do when we go Yom Kippur to synagogue, or we have our weekends, or on a holiday where we're more spiritual in nature. And we dedicate time. Beautiful. Time for prayer, time for study, time for meditation, time for music. But the rest of our lives, we're busy with survival. What Joseph teaches, and though it was not something he planned for, he would have remained a shepherd, but you don't have to be a shepherd to touch the deepest levels of the divine, of transcendence. in your material life, and even in the center of it, even the superpower, even when you're dealing with grain, he always retained and maintained that innocence, that connection. And that's what his father recognized and said, wow, 22 years passed. It wasn't just 22 years. He was thrust in a completely different world, a very materialistic world, a pagan world. And yet, he was able to integrate because he had the charity box on his desk, so to speak. So it's a lesson for all of us from Joseph. Lesson number one. Lesson number two, I alluded to earlier. Think of this. A young man, 17 years old, loves his father and his mother, is torn away from them, sold into slavery due to the jealousy of his brothers. So how angry would a person like that be? And how justified would he be in his anger? Everybody's read The Count of Monte Cristo, vengeance, what they did to him. And you sympathize with him, as tough as he is, because look what they did to a person. For no reason, an innocent person, he did nothing wrong. So you would think when he finally has the power and he's now a leader, he had all the power in the world, they needed him. You would think he would exact vengeance. And not only does he not do that, he says to them, do not feel guilty that you did this to me. God brought me here. In other words, he was able to rise above being a victim. Now they were responsible for their actions. This is not about vindicating them. This is not about getting them off the hook. And years later, the Jewish people would suffer greatly. 10 martyrs would be killed because of these brothers, what they did. But let's not address that. Let's address, what Joseph was saying, the psychological lesson. No matter what happens to me in my life, even if I could point fingers, even if I'm justified in doing so, I am never going to be a victim. I'm always going to be someone that recognizes that life is driven by a higher narrative. It's called divine providence. And though, yes, it was they that sold me into slavery, it was they that caused me to be here, but look what happened. I became a leader. I saved the world. Maybe because God wanted me to be here in this place, to interpret those dreams, and then to be able to develop a whole industry that would save the world from a famine that was destroying and could have killed who knows how many people. So he looked at the bigger narrative. But it's more than just looking at the narrative. It's not allowing, I'm not a victim of circumstances. How many of us, when something happens to us, and far lesser grievance than Joseph had, sometimes things that we just imagine in our minds, or even if it's real, but it's not that life or death. And even if it is, you are doing yourself a disservice when you play victim. When you recognize that things that happen, we do not control the circumstances around us, but we control how we will navigate. That's the second lesson we learned from Joseph. And it's very actually connected to the first one, because he was a person that always remained connected to something higher, the higher purpose. He never lost sight of his personal mission statement, and that overrode his business mission statement. Whatever you do in this world is just a stepping stone. So both the work you do and the things that happen to you are all part of a larger narrative. And you have to sometimes, I don't want to use the word surrender, it's not a word that people like, but it is surrender. You have to sometimes accept there's a larger narrative. You know what happens? You become emancipated. Because then you're not in control, even if you grew up in a home that was abusive, a home that your jealous brothers may have hurt you, or parents, or other relatives, or other people. So you're justified. You can point fingers and say, look what they did to me. They're causing me all kinds of psychological, emotional pain, insecurities, fears, difficulty to trust, challenges in relationships and intimacy. All the things we go to therapy for. What we learn from Joseph is, yes, those people that did it, they deserve what they deserve, and that will be between them and their maker and their creator. But you don't want to be an extension and a victim of them, because that means they still control you. Even if you're running away from them, they're controlling you because you're running. You want to say, things happen to me, but I'm not defined by what has happened to me. I've suffered, but I'm not a sufferer. I'm not defined by the challenges, by the difficulties, and by the abuse or the traumas that have impacted my life. It happened to me, but that's not me. And that's what Joseph was declaring. He was freeing himself from them and saying, no, I'm here because I was meant to be here in order to save the world. And that's how we have to look at our lives, that whatever has happened, It led you somewhere. How are you using your particular situation and saying, doesn't matter how I got here, but I'm here now. How am I using it to save the world in some way? My little world, the larger world, my family, my community. This is an attitude that we learn from Joseph, and exclusively Joseph. Every character in the Bible has something to teach us. But Joseph, the Prince of Egypt, teaches us these two critical lessons. Integrating spirit into the material part of your life. And secondly, understanding the larger narrative. So no matter what happens to you, whether it's due to COVID, whether it's due to wars, whether it's due to the disruptions, upheavals, and uncertainties of our times. Because this couldn't be more relevant now. Now, it couldn't be more relevant message than for now, which is the uncertainty, the disruptions, the unknowns, to know that you can learn to navigate because there's a larger narrative. And when you allow that to take hold, you become a stronger person, clearer, and allows you to move forward with a different level of confidence. These are the lessons we learn from our dear Joseph. This has been Simon Jacobson. Meaningforlife.com is our website. Please, if this is the first time you're participating, check out all our different offerings, different topics, for different audiences, for different interests. Basically taking here, in this case, the best-selling book of all time called the Bible, its characters, decoding it and applying it to our lives, lessons for life. And I'd love to hear your feedback, thoughts, comments, questions. And of course, share this with everyone you come in contact with if you feel this was a valuable message. Be well, be blessed, and thank you so much.